Omar Rashid controlled oil fields worth billions, commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, and could move mountains with a single phone call. But at 3 a.m. in his marble-floored mansion in Qatar, he stood helpless in silk pajamas, watching 2 4-year-old hurricanes destroy everything in their path. His twin sons, Zaid and Malik, hadn't slept through the night in months. What started as typical childhood energy had spiraled into something no nanny, therapist, or specialist could handle, until she arrived, a soft-spoken woman from Senegal whose unconventional methods would be captured on hidden cameras, revealing a miracle that would shake Omar to his very core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Persian Gulf as Omar Rashid stood in his corner office on the 47th floor of the Rashid Tower, overlooking the glittering skyline of Doha. At 38, he had built an empire that stretched from the oil fields of Kazakhstan to the shipping ports of Singapore. His company, Rashid International, employed over 15,000 people and had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the Middle East. But success had come at a price that no amount of money could repay. Omar's reflections stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows, dark circles under his eyes, a face that had aged 5 years in the past 6 months, and shoulders that carried weight no business deal had ever placed on them. His expensive Italian suit couldn't hide the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Rashid, your 9 a.m. is here," his assistant Layla announced in Arabic. "Cancel it," Omar replied, his voice hoarse. "Cancel everything until noon." He had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep, but today even that felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. His phone buzzed with the familiar notification from the home security app, another alert from the nursery cameras. He closed his eyes, knowing what he would see, but opened the app anyway. There they were, Zaid and Malik, his 4-year-old twin sons, wide awake at 8:47 a.m. after another sleepless night. But they weren't playing or laughing like normal children. Zaid was methodically pulling books from the shelves and throwing them across the room with mechanical precision. Malik sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, his hands pressed tightly over his ears, mouth open in what Omar knew was a silent scream. The 19th nanny in 6 months, Mrs. Patterson from the UK, stood frozen in the doorway. Her face wore the same expression they all eventually developed, a mixture of defeat, confusion, and barely concealed fear. By afternoon, she would tender her resignation. Just like all the others, Omar's throat tightened as he remembered when the twins were babies, sleeping peacefully in their matching cribs, tiny fists curled against their cheeks. Their mother, Yasmin, would sing to them in the evenings, her voice floating through their Doha mansion like honey. The boys had been perfect then, healthy, beautiful, responding to every smile and laugh with their own. Everything changed when Yasmin died. The car accident on the Corniche Road 18 months ago had taken more than just his wife. It had taken his son's anchor, their sense of safety, their ability to exist peacefully in the world. The trauma had manifested in ways no pediatric psychologist could fully explain. Zaid had developed what doctors called explosive behavioral episodes, moments where he would destroy everything within reach with calm, methodical precision. Malik had retreated inward, becoming hypersensitive to sound, light, and touch, often spending hours in nonverbal distress. Sleep had become their enemy. The twins would wake at all hours, sometimes screaming, sometimes destroying their room in eerie silence. They had gone through mattresses, furniture, toys, and caregivers at a rate that had become both expensive and heartbreaking. Omar had tried everything his wealth could buy. He flew in child psychiatrists from Johns Hopkins, converted an entire wing of his mansion into a sensory therapy center, and even hired a team of Swiss specialists who promised breakthrough techniques. The house staff walked on eggshells. The security team had been trained in child behavioral management, and Omar had spent more on therapeutic interventions in the past year than most people earned in a lifetime. Nothing worked. The boys rejected every caregiver with increasing intensity. They had bitten, scratched, and screamed at trained professionals who came highly recommended. The last therapist, Dr. Müller from Vienna, had left after 3 days, telling Omar that the twins needed residential care for their own safety. Thus, the suggestion had hit Omar like a physical blow. Residential care meant sending his sons away, admitting that he had failed as a father, acknowledging that his children were beyond his ability to help. It meant accepting that Yasmin's death had broken something that couldn't be fixed. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed his brother Samir's name. "Omar, how are the boys this morning?" Samir's voice carried the careful tone family members use when they're afraid of the answer. "The same," Omar replied simply. "Listen, brother, I've been thinking maybe it's time to consider Dr. Müller's suggestion. There are excellent facilities in Switzerland, very private, very—" "No," Omar's voice cut through the phone like a blade. "They're not going anywhere. Omar, you can't keep living like this. You look terrible. The business is suffering because you can't focus, and those boys need professional help that you can't provide at home." Omar knew Samir was right about one thing. The business was suffering. He had missed 3 major meetings. This week alone, unable to leave the house when the twins were having particularly difficult days. His partners in Dubai were starting to ask questions, and competitors were circling like vultures, sensing weakness. But sending his sons away felt like betraying Yasmin's memory. She had dreamed of raising them together, of family dinners, and birthday parties, of watching them grow into men who would carry on the Rashid name with honor. How could he explain to her spirit that he had given up on her children? "I'll find another way," Omar said quietly. "What way? You've tried everything. Every specialist, every technique, I said I'll find another way." Omar ended the call and immediately regretted his harshness. Samir meant well, but he didn't understand. Nobody understood what it felt like to watch your children suffer and know that everything you touched seemed to make it worse. The security app pinged again. This time the camera showed Mrs. Patterson walking quickly down the main hallway, her suitcases already packed. She didn't even wait for the afternoon to quit. Omar sank into his leather chair, a piece of furniture that had witnessed him close billion-dollar deals, negotiate international contracts, and build an empire. Now it held a broken father who had run out of solutions. His desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Rashid, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about the childcare position, but she doesn't have an appointment. Should I send her up?" Omar said without thinking. At this point, what did he have to lose? As he waited, Omar looked once more at the security feed from the twins' room. Zaid had moved on to systematically emptying the toy chest, while Malik remained curled in the corner, hands over his ears. They were 4 years old, but they carried trauma like old men carried war wounds. Silently, heavily, and without hope for relief. The elevator chimed softly in the hallway outside his office. In a few moments, another caregiver would walk through his door, full of confidence and credentials, promising to be different from all the others. And in a few days or weeks, she would leave, just like the rest, taking another piece of his hope with her. But something felt different about this morning. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the Gulf waters, or maybe it was the quiet desperation that had finally pushed him beyond caring about qualifications and references. Whatever it was, Omar found himself straightening his tie and walking toward his office door, preparing to meet the woman who would either become the 20th failed nanny or something else entirely. The elevator doors opened, and Omar's life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman who stepped out of the elevator bore no resemblance to the parade of professionally dressed nannies who had graced Omar's office over the past months. Where others had arrived in crisp uniforms with leather portfolios, she wore a simple blue dress with intricate embroidered patterns along the sleeves. Clearly handmade, clearly not expensive. Her head wrap was a vibrant orange that seemed to capture sunlight, and she carried nothing more than a small woven bag slung across her shoulder. "Mr. Rashid," her voice was soft, accented with the musical cadence of West African French. "I am Aminata Diallo. I heard about your sons." Omar studied her face as she approached. She appeared to be in her early 30s with kind eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience beyond her years. There was something unsettling about her directness. Most applicants began with nervous pleasantries or attempts to impress him with their credentials. This woman simply stated why she was there. "Please, sit." Omar gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of his desk, "though I should mention that I wasn't expecting anyone today. My assistant typically schedules—" "I know," Aminata interrupted gently, settling into the chair with a grace that suggested she was perfectly comfortable despite the opulent surroundings. "I spoke with Mrs. Patterson in the lobby. She told me she was leaving. She also told me about Zaid and Malik." Omar raised an eyebrow. The outgoing nannies rarely discussed the children with strangers, bound as they were by confidentiality agreements. "What exactly did she tell you?" "That they are beautiful boys carrying heavy sadness. That they have forgotten how to trust the world. That everyone keeps trying to fix them instead of understanding them." Aminata's hands remained folded in her lap, but her eyes never left Omar's face. "She said you are a good father who has tried everything except believing that healing takes time." The words hit Omar like a gentle slap. In 6 months of interviews with childcare professionals, no one had spoken about his sons with such humanity. They discussed behavioral interventions and therapeutic protocols, but never acknowledged that his children were simply hurting. "Do you have credentials?" Omar asked, though he found himself caring less about the answer than he should. Aminata reached into her woven bag and pulled out a single folded paper. "I have this," she said. Handing it to him, Omar unfolded what appeared to be a letter written in French on letterhead from a medical clinic in Dakar, Senegal. His French was decent enough to understand the general content. A glowing recommendation for Aminata's work with traumatized children at a refugee center. The letter was dated 3 years ago and signed by Dr. Ibrahima Ndiaye, Chief of Pediatrics. "This is very impressive," Omar said, though he noted the absence of formal certifications, degrees, or the usual documentation he had come to expect. "But it's quite different from caring for children in a private home. My sons have very specific needs, very complex." "Mr. Rashid," Aminata interrupted again, this time leaning forward slightly, "may I tell you what I see when I look at your face?" The question was so unexpected that Omar found himself nodding. "I see a man who loves his children more than his own life. I see someone who has not slept properly in months because he lies awake wondering if he is failing them. I see a father who would give every dollar he has earned to hear his sons laugh the way they did before their world broke apart." Omar felt his throat constrict. It was as if she had looked directly into his soul and spoken aloud the thoughts he barely dared admit to himself. "I also see," Aminata continued, "a man who has been told by many experts that love is not enough, that he needs techniques and programs and interventions. But sometimes, Mr. Rashid, love is exactly enough. It just needs to be given time to work." "The other caregivers," Omar said carefully, "they have found my sons to be challenging. Zaid can become violent without warning. Malik doesn't speak at all anymore. They don't sleep, they don't eat regularly, and they have never responded positively to anyone since their mother died." Aminata nodded thoughtfully. "In my village, we have a saying. A seed will not grow in winter soil, but the same seed will flourish when spring returns. Your sons are waiting for their spring, and you believe you can provide that?" Omar asked, surprised by the hope creeping into his voice, despite his best efforts to remain skeptical. "I believe they will provide it for themselves when they feel safe enough to try." She stood gracefully and walked to the window that overlooked the sprawling city below. "Mr. Rashid, what was their favorite thing to do with their mother?" This question caught Omar off guard. None of the previous caregivers had asked about Yasmin or the children's life before the accident. Yasmin used to sing to them. Every evening after dinner, she would sit with them on the terrace and sing traditional Qatari lullabies while they watched the sunset. And since she died, no one sings to them anymore. The admission felt like a confession. "I tried once, but my voice isn't. I'm not musical like she was." Aminata turned from the window. "Music is not about having a beautiful voice, Mr. Rashid. It is about creating a bridge between two hearts. Your sons remember their mother's songs, but they are afraid to listen because remembering brings pain. So what would you do differently than the others?" "I would not try to make them forget their pain. I would help them remember that pain and love can exist in the same heart." She returned to her chair, and Omar noticed she moved with the careful quiet of someone accustomed to being around fragile things. "I would sing to them, yes, but not to replace their mother's voice, to honor it." Omar found himself considering this woman more seriously than any candidate in months. There was something about her calm confidence that felt different from the clinical assurance of trained professionals. She spoke about his sons as if she already knew them, as if their healing was not just possible but inevitable. "Your experience with traumatized children," Omar said, glancing again at the letter from Dakar. "Can you tell me more about that?" Aminata's expression grew more serious. "The refugee center where I worked received families fleeing conflict in Mali and Burkina Faso. Many children arrived having witnessed things no child should see. They came to us silent, angry, afraid of their own shadows. The traditional approach was to put them in counseling immediately, to talk through their trauma. But that didn't work. For some, yes. But for others, talking about pain before they felt safe enough to trust us only made them retreat further." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I learned that healing begins not with words, but with presence, with showing children that the world can be gentle again, even if only in small moments." "And how long did this process typically take?" "There is no typically, Mr. Rashid. Some children began to smile within weeks. Others took months to make eye contact. But all of them, every single one, eventually remembered how to be children. Again, because that is what they are meant to be." Omar felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. For the first time in months, someone was talking about his son's recovery not as a remote possibility, requiring professional intervention, but as a natural process that needed only the right conditions to unfold. "I should tell you," Omar said, "that my sons have been particularly resistant to new caregivers. The last woman lasted only 4 days. The one before her made it 2 weeks, but left after Zaid threw a toy that required her to get stitches. Were they trying to hurt these women, or were they trying to protect themselves?" The question reframed everything. Omar had been focused on managing his son's behavior, on preventing incidents, on maintaining order. He hadn't considered that their aggression might be a form of communication, a desperate attempt to control their environment when everything else felt chaotic. I hadn't thought of it that way. Children who have lost their sense of safety will test every new person who enters their world. They are asking, will you abandon me like death abandoned my mother? Will you hurt me if I trust you? Will you stay if I show you my worst self? Aminata's voice grew even softer. Your sons are not being difficult, Mr. Rashid. They are being careful. Omar stood and walked to his desk, where a framed photo showed Yasmin laughing as 2-year-old Zaid and Malik climbed over her like playful puppies. The image felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, a different family entirely. When could you start? He asked, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. Today, if you wish. But I have one condition. Omar turned, eyebrows raised. In 6 months of hiring discussions, no caregiver had ever presented conditions to him. For the first week, I would like you to trust my methods completely. No interventions, no modifications, no suggestions from well-meaning family members or friends. Just 1 week to let Zaid and Malik show me who they are, beneath their fear. And if nothing changes in that week, then I will leave, and you will have lost nothing but 7 days. She stood, shouldering her small bag. But if something does change, even something small, will you give me more time to help them find their way back to themselves? Omar looked once more at the photo, then at the security feed on his phone showing his sons in their eternal dance of destruction and withdrawal. Mrs. Patterson was gone. The 20th nanny had quit before lunch on her first day. His options had narrowed to this gentle stranger with no credentials and unconventional theories, or admitting defeat and sending his children away. 1 week, he agreed, extending his hand. But I should warn you, they won't make it easy. Aminata shook his hand with surprising firmness. Mr. Rashid, if healing were easy, your sons would not need me. They need someone who understands that the most broken hearts require the most patient hands. As she prepared to leave his office and meet the children who would either validate her confidence or prove her wrong, Omar felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months. Genuine hope. Not the desperate hope of a father grasping at straws, but the quiet hope of someone who had finally found a guide willing to walk into the darkness with him. What he didn't know was that Aminata carried her own shadows, her own reasons for understanding the language of loss. And what neither of them knew was that every moment of the coming week would be captured by the comprehensive camera system Omar had installed throughout his home, creating a record of what would either be the beginning of healing or the final confirmation that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. The ride from Omar's office to his mansion in West Bay took 35 minutes through Doha's gleaming corridors of glass and steel. Aminata sat quietly in the passenger seat of his Mercedes, observing the city's transformation from financial district to residential luxury with the same calm attention she had shown in his office. Omar found himself stealing glances at her, in his peripheral vision, wondering what thoughts occupied a mind that spoke so confidently about healing children everyone else had declared unreachable. "Tell me about their routines," Aminata said as they passed the Museum of Islamic Art, its geometric silhouette reflecting off the calm waters of the bay. "They don't really have routines anymore," Omar admitted. Yasmin was the one who maintained structure. She had them on schedules for meals, naps, bedtime stories. Since she died, everything has become chaotic. They eat when they're hungry, sleep when exhaustion overtakes them, and spend most days in what the therapists call dysregulated states. "And you, what is your routine with them?" The question made Omar realize how disconnected he had become from his sons' daily lives. "I see them in the mornings before work, if they're awake. Sometimes in the evenings, depending on meetings. Weekends are... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Difficult. The nannies usually handle the day-to-day care. When did you last spend a full day alone with them? Omar's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The honest answer was that he hadn't been alone with both boys for more than a few hours since Yasmin's funeral. The chaos that ensued whenever caregivers were absent had taught him to ensure backup was always available. It's been a while, he said simply. Aminata nodded without judgment. Today, after I meet them, would you be willing to stay home, not to help or intervene, just to be present in the house? I have a conference call with Singapore at 4 p.m. and... Mr. Rashid, she said gently, your sons have learned that the people who matter most to them disappear. Their mother disappeared forever. You disappear to work. Caregivers disappear when they quit. If I am to help them trust again, they need to see that their father is not disappearing too. The observation stung because it was true. Omar had thrown himself into work partly out of necessity. Someone had to maintain the business empire that funded their lifestyle and medical care, but also out of avoidance. Watching his sons suffer was agony, and work provided a respite from that pain. I'll reschedule the call, he said. As they turned into the private driveway of the Rashid estate, Aminata sat forward, taking in the sprawling villa with its traditional Islamic architecture blended with modern amenities. The house was beautiful, marble fountains, manicured gardens, a pool that sparkled like a jewel. But Omar saw it through her eyes, a palace that had become a prison for two small boys who had lost their ability to find joy in paradise. It's very grand, Aminata said simply. Too grand, probably. Yasmin always said the house was too big for a family, but I thought... Omar trailed off, remembering his younger self's certainty that success meant providing the biggest and best of everything. They parked in the circular driveway, and Omar felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Would this be another disaster? Another well-meaning person driven away by his son's pain-fueled behavior? He had told Aminata about the challenges, but experiencing Zaid's explosive episodes or Malik's complete withdrawal was different from hearing about them. The front door opened before they reached it. Layla, the head housekeeper, appeared with the weary expression Omar had grown accustomed to seeing on his staff's faces. "Mr. Omar," she said in Arabic, then switched to English when she noticed Aminata. "The boys are in the playroom. There was an incident with the breakfast dishes, but no one was hurt." "What kind of incident?" Omar asked, though he could guess. "Zaid threw his plate when I offered him eggs. Then Malik started crying and wouldn't stop until I turned off all the lights and left them alone." Layla glanced apologetically at Aminata. "They're very sensitive right now." "Thank you, Layla," Omar said. "This is Aminata. She'll be caring for the boys starting today." Layla's expression showed the polite skepticism of someone who had watched 19 caregivers come and go. "Welcome," she said to Aminata. I hope things go better." As they walked through the marble-floored entryway, Aminata's attention was caught by a series of family photographs lining the hallway. She paused at one showing Yasmin laughing as tiny Zaid and Malik splashed in a kiddie pool, their faces bright with pure happiness. "They look like their mother," she observed. "Yes," Omar said quietly. "Sometimes I think that makes it harder for them. Every time they look in a mirror, they see her eyes. Or perhaps they see proof that she is still with them." The different perspective stopped Omar in his tracks. He had never considered that his son's resemblance to Yasmin might be a source of comfort rather than pain. They continued down the hallway, passing the formal dining room, the library, and the sitting areas that now felt more like museum displays than living spaces. The house had become too quiet, too careful, as if everyone was walking around a sleeping dragon they feared to wake. The playroom was at the end of the east wing, designed by Yasmin to be a perfect space for children, soft carpeting, built in. Bookshelves, a reading nook with oversized cushions, and toys organized in colorful bins. Now it looked like a battlefield after surrender. Books were scattered across the floor, puzzle pieces mixed with broken crayons, and in the center of the chaos sat the two architects of destruction. Zaid, at 4 years old, had inherited his father's serious dark eyes and his mother's delicate features. He sat cross-legged next to an overturned toy chest, methodically tearing pages from a picture book with the focused intensity of someone performing an important task. Each page was torn into exactly 4 pieces before being added to a growing pile beside him. Malik, identical to his brother but somehow entirely different, had wedged himself into the corner where 2 bookcases met. His knees were drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped around his head, and he rocked in a rhythm that seemed to match some internal metronome only he could hear. Omar felt the familiar wash of helplessness. "Boys," he said softly, but neither child looked up or acknowledged his presence. Aminata said nothing. She simply stood in the doorway, observing with the same quiet attention she had shown everything else. Omar waited for her to introduce herself, to try the gentle approaches other caregivers had attempted, but she remained perfectly still. After several minutes of silence, Aminata slowly lowered herself to sit on the floor just inside the doorway. She didn't move closer to the boys, didn't speak, didn't try to engage them in any way. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, watching them with patient acceptance. Zaid's page-tearing continued with mechanical precision. Malik's rocking maintained its steady rhythm, but Omar noticed something subtle. Zaid's movements had slowed slightly, and Malik's rocking seemed less frantic, as if the presence of someone who wasn't trying to change or fix them had introduced a different energy into the room. "What are you doing?" Omar whispered. "Listening," Aminata replied quietly, not taking her eyes off the children. 10 more minutes passed. Omar's phone buzzed with messages, but he ignored them. This was the longest anyone had sat in the same room with his sons without some kind of crisis erupting. Then, something remarkable happened. Zaid finished tearing his current page, added the pieces to his pile, and instead of reaching for another book, he looked up. His dark eyes found Aminata sitting by the door, and he stared at her with the intense curiosity of a child encountering something unexpected. Aminata didn't react to his gaze. She didn't smile encouragingly or speak in the high, bright voice adults often used with children. She simply acknowledged his attention with a small nod, as if he were an adult deserving of respect rather than a damaged child requiring careful handling. Zaid tilted his head, studying her orange head wrap and embroidered dress. After a long moment, he said something that made Omar's breath catch in his throat. "You're not white." It was the first complete sentence Zaid had spoken to a new person in months. The previous caregivers had been met with either complete silence or screaming protests. "No," Aminata replied simply, "I am not." The other ladies were white. Yes, they were. Zaid considered this information with the seriousness of a philosopher contemplating universal truths. Mama wasn't white either. What color was Mama? Brown, like dates. Papa says we're brown like dates too, but lighter. Omar felt tears prick. His eyes. This was the first time Zaid had mentioned his mother in conversation since the funeral. "Dates are very sweet," Aminata said, "and they grow strong in the desert sun." "I don't like the sun anymore," Zaid said matter-of-factly. "It's too loud." Instead of correcting him or explaining that sunlight doesn't make noise, Aminata nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the sun can feel very loud. What does it sound like to you?" Zaid's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised that an adult was taking his perception seriously. Like when Papa's car starts in the morning. Vroom, but it doesn't stop. That does sound loud. Do you know any quiet places where the loud sun can't reach you? The corner where Malik sits is quiet, Zaid said, glancing at his brother, who had stopped rocking and was now listening intently while pretending not to. Is Malik good at finding quiet places? Malik is the best at quiet. Sometimes I wish I could be quiet like him, but my hands need to move things. Omar realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, not just Zaid speaking to a stranger, but his son articulating feelings and observations with a complexity that revealed an inner life Omar had almost forgotten existed. Moving things can be important too, Aminata said. Your hands are telling a story. What story are they telling today? Zaid looked down at his pile of torn paper, then back at Aminata. They're telling the story about when everything got broken. Ah, Aminata nodded. That is a very important story. Stories about broken things need to be told. For the first time since entering the room, she moved. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her woven bag and pulled out a small object, a wooden bowl, carved from dark wood and polished smooth. She placed it on the floor between herself and the boys, then returned her hands to her lap. Zaid stared at the bowl with intense curiosity. What's that for? It's for holding important things, Aminata replied. Things that matter to people. What kind of things? Stories, feelings, memories that are too big to carry in your heart alone. Malik had stopped rocking entirely now and was watching the conversation with the focused attention of someone following a fascinating performance. Could it hold my broken story? Zaid asked. If you wanted it to, yes. Zaid considered this for a long moment, then carefully picked up a handful of his torn paper pieces. He looked at Aminata, then at the bowl, then back at her. Can Malik's quiet stories go in there too? If Malik wants them to. For the first time in months, Malik lifted his head and looked directly at another person. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, rusty from disuse. My stories are too scared to come out. Scared stories are welcome too, Aminata said gently. The bowl doesn't mind if stories are scared or sad or angry. It just holds them so they don't have to live inside you all by themselves. Omar watched in amazement as his sons, children who had rejected every attempt at connection for months, began to engage with this quiet woman who asked nothing of them except to be exactly who they were. She wasn't trying to fix them or change them or make them feel better. She was simply creating space for their pain to exist, alongside the possibility of something different. As the afternoon sun streamed through the playroom windows, Omar saw the first glimpse of hope he had felt since the day Yasmin died. His sons were still broken, still struggling, still carrying wounds that would take time to heal, but for the first time in months, they were not carrying those wounds alone. What he didn't realize was that every word, every gesture, every small breakthrough was being captured by the sophisticated camera system he had installed throughout the house. In the days to come, those recordings would reveal not just Aminata's unconventional methods, but secrets about her past that would challenge everything Omar thought he knew about the woman he had invited into his children's lives. 3 days had passed since Aminata's arrival, and the Rashid mansion had begun to breathe differently. Omar noticed it first in the small changes, the way staff members no longer walked on eggshells past the playroom, how the house's marble corridors carried the sound of children's voices instead of crying or silence. But the real transformation was happening in moments he witnessed through casual observation, glimpses that made him question everything he thought he knew about healing. On Wednesday morning, Omar found himself lingering over his Arabic coffee in the breakfast room instead of rushing to the office. Through the large windows overlooking the garden, he could see Aminata sitting cross-legged on a blanket under the shade of a date palm. Zaid and Malik sat several feet away from her, but for the first time in months, they were in the same outdoor space without distress. Aminata was humming, not a recognizable melody, but something that seemed to weave itself into the morning breeze. Zaid had arranged a collection of smooth stones in geometric patterns on the grass, while Malik was drawing invisible shapes in the air with his finger, his movements flowing like a conductor leading an orchestra only he could hear. Omar's phone buzzed with the usual morning barrage of urgent messages, but he found himself ignoring them. How long had it been since he had simply watched his sons exist peacefully in the world? When had he stopped noticing the way Zaid's mind worked in patterns and symmetries, or how Malik's silent movements carried their own form of communication? "Sir?" Layla appeared beside his table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Your driver is waiting for the usual departure time." "Tell him to wait," Omar said, not taking his eyes off the garden scene. "I want to see what happens next." What happened next defied every prediction the child psychologists had made about his son's trajectory. Aminata reached into her ever-present woven bag and pulled out what appeared to be a bundle of colorful fabric. She spread it on the blanket, a piece of traditional West African textile with bold geometric patterns in deep blues, rich golds, and vibrant oranges. Zaid's head snapped up immediately, his pattern-seeking mind clearly captivated by the complex designs. He stood and took a tentative step toward the blanket, then another. Omar held his breath, waiting for the retreat that usually followed any moment of his son's curiosity about something new. But Zaid didn't retreat. Instead, he knelt at the edge of the fabric and began tracing one of the geometric patterns with his finger, following its intricate pathway with the same focused intensity he usually reserved for tearing paper. "This one looks like a maze," Zaid said, his voice carrying further in the garden's stillness than it had in the enclosed playroom. "It is a maze," Aminata replied. "In my village, we believe that life is like this pattern, many paths that seem to lead nowhere, but if you follow them with patience, they always lead somewhere important." "Where does this path lead?" Zaid asked, continuing to trace the design. "Why don't you follow it and tell me?" As Zaid's finger wound through the fabric's intricate pattern, something remarkable occurred. Malik, who had been drawing his invisible shape several feet away, began moving closer. Not directly. His approach was sideways, circular, like a cautious animal drawn by curiosity but ready to flee. Eventually, he positioned himself where he could see the fabric without being too close to Aminata or his brother. Omar realized he was witnessing something the behavioral specialists had insisted was impossible. His sons self-regulating their need for space while simultaneously showing interest in shared activity. All the expensive therapy programs had focused on forcing interaction, but Aminata was allowing connection to emerge naturally. "Malik," Zaid said suddenly, looking up from the fabric. "Come see this part. It looks like the garden maze at the museum." Omar's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. Zaid was initiating social interaction, something he hadn't done since before Yasmin's death. Even more remarkably, he was remembering and referencing a positive experience from their past, a family trip to the MIA park where they had played in the children's garden while Yasmin sketched the museum's architecture. Malik's response was equally unprecedented. Instead of ignoring his brother or retreating, he inched closer until he could see the pattern Zaid was indicating. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Mama liked mazes. She said they teach you that being lost is just part of finding your way." The words hit Omar like a physical blow, not because they were painful, but because they carried hope. For the first time since the funeral, one of his sons had mentioned their mother without trauma, without tears, without the emotional dysregulation that usually accompanied any reference to their loss. He was, both boys said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise, as if hearing their own voices in stereo had caught them off guard. Omar watched as something shifted between his sons in that moment, a recognition that they shared not just grief, but memories worth protecting. Zaid reached out and touched Malik's hand, a gesture of connection that would have been unthinkable even days earlier. "Do you want to trace the maze together?" Zaid asked. Malik nodded, and for the next hour Omar watched his sons follow the fabric's intricate patterns with their fingers, sometimes separately, sometimes with their hands overlapping on the same pathway. Aminata remained present but unobtrusive, occasionally offering quiet observations about the design's origins or asking gentle questions that encouraged the boys to share their own interpretations. By the time Omar finally left for the office, his usual morning anxiety had been replaced by something he barely recognized: excitement about returning home. For months, coming home had meant bracing himself for reports of disasters, meltdowns, and failed interventions. Now he found himself wondering what small miracle might unfold in his absence. The afternoon brought its own revelations. Omar returned early from a meeting in the financial district, using the excuse of forgotten documents to justify his eagerness to witness more of whatever transformation was occurring in his home. He found Aminata in the kitchen with both boys, engaged in what appeared to be cooking, an activity that had been impossible for months due to Zaid's tendency to throw food and Malik's refusal to touch anything with wet or sticky textures. "We're making Mama's date cookies," Zaid announced when he saw his father in the doorway. Omar's heart clenched. Yasmin's date cookies had been a family tradition, a recipe passed down from her grandmother, something she made every Friday afternoon, while the boys helped by organizing the ingredients in elaborate patterns on the counter. "How do you remember the recipe?" Omar asked, amazed that his 4-year-olds retained such specific memories. "Malik remembers everything about Mama," Zaid said matter-of-factly. "He just doesn't usually talk about it." Malik looked up from the bowl where he was carefully measuring flour. "I remember because I want to. The other things, the loud car, the hospital smell, the crying, I don't want to remember those. But cookies and songs and garden walks, those are good memories. Aminata says I can choose which memories to keep close and which ones to put in the bowl." The wooden bowl sat on the counter nearby, now containing various objects the boys had chosen to represent difficult feelings. Torn paper from Zaid, a small stone from Malik, and what appeared to be a wilted flower Aminata had contributed. "The sack bowl doesn't make the sad memories disappear," Aminata explained to Omar, "but it holds them, so the boys can visit their sadness when they need to, instead of carrying it everywhere they go." Omar marveled at the simple wisdom of this approach. Every therapeutic intervention had focused on processing trauma, talking through it, analyzing it. But Aminata was teaching his sons that they could have a relationship with their pain, acknowledging it without being consumed by it. As the afternoon progressed, Omar found himself drawn into the cookie-making process, despite his complete lack of culinary skills. Zaid assigned him the task of arranging dates in precise geometric patterns, while Malik supervised the mixing with the kind of focused attention he had once brought to his withdrawal behaviors. The kitchen filled with the warm scents of cinnamon and cardamom, aromas that had been absent from the house since Yasmin's death. But instead of triggering painful memories, the familiar smells seemed to awaken something hopeful in all of them. "Papa," Malik said suddenly, looking up from his careful stirring, "can we eat these on the terrace like we used to with Mama?" Question was asked with such simple hope that Omar felt his throat constrict. The terrace had been Yasmin's favorite place in the evening, where she would sit with the boys and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that matched her vibrant scarves. "If you want to," Omar managed to say. "I want to," Zaid chimed in. "But only if Aminata comes too. She knows how to sit quiet without making the air feel heavy." Omar glanced at Aminata, who nodded with the same calm acceptance she brought to everything. "I would be honored," she said simply. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the four of them sat on the terrace that had been empty for 18 months. The boys positioned themselves close enough to share the plate of cookies, but far enough apart to maintain their individual space. Aminata sat slightly apart, present but not intrusive, while Omar found himself in the strange position of being a guest in his own family dynamic. The cookies were imperfect, some burned around the edges, others too crumbly, none matching the consistent perfection of Yasmin's traditional batches. But as Zaid and Malik bit into them with serious concentration, Omar realized that perfection had never been the point. The point was the making, the sharing, the choice to create sweetness. Together, despite the bitter knowledge that some people who should be present never would be again. "These taste like memory cookies," Malik said thoughtfully, using the kind of poetic language that had emerged more frequently since Aminata's arrival. "What do memory cookies taste like?" Aminata asked. "Like Mama, but also like us now. Like sad and happy mixed together, but the happy is stronger." Omar felt tears spring to his eyes, not from grief this time, but from recognition. His son had articulated something profound about healing, that it didn't mean forgetting pain or returning to an earlier state of innocence, but rather learning to hold sorrow and joy simultaneously, allowing happiness to coexist with loss. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky transition from blue to gold to deep purple, Omar realized that Aminata had accomplished something remarkable. She hadn't fixed his sons or erased their trauma. Instead, she had created conditions for them to rediscover their own capacity for connection, curiosity, and even moments of peace. But what impressed Omar most was how she had done it without fanfare, without therapeutic jargon, without the clinical distance that had characterized every other intervention. She had simply shown up as herself, patient, present, and willing to meet his sons exactly where they were. The evening ended with Zaid and Malik walking to their bedrooms without protest, something that hadn't happened since before Yasmin's death. As Omar tucked them in, Zaid reached up and touched his father's face with cookie-sticky fingers. "Papa," he said seriously, "I think the sad stories in the bowl are getting smaller." "Why do you think that is?" Omar asked. "Because the happy stories are getting bigger. Aminata says there's always room for both, but we get to choose which ones we feed." As Omar turned off the lights and headed to his own room, he reflected on the profound changes he had witnessed in just 3 days. His sons were still healing, still fragile, still carrying wounds that would take time to fully mend. But for the first time since Yasmin's death, he believed that healing was not just possible, but inevitable. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test everything Aminata had built with his sons. And what he couldn't have anticipated was that someone very close to him had been watching these developments with growing concern, preparing to take action that would threaten to destroy the fragile progress they had all worked so hard to achieve. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, jarring Omar from the first peaceful night's sleep he'd experienced in months. His phone's shrill ring cut through the pre-dawn quiet of his bedroom, and when he saw his brother Samir's name on the display, his stomach immediately tightened with familiar dread. "Omar, we need to talk." Samir's voice was tense, carrying the kind of urgency that usually preceded bad news about business deals or family crises. "It's not even 7 in the morning, Samir. Can't this wait?" "It's about the nanny." The African woman. I've been doing some research. Omar sat up in bed, instantly alert. What kind of research? The kind you should have done before letting a stranger into your home with your children. There was a pause, the sound of papers, shuffling. Omar, there are things about Aminata Diallo that don't add up, things you need to know. Such as, meet me at the office in an hour. This isn't a conversation for the phone. The line went dead, leaving Omar staring at his ceiling as anxiety crawled up his spine like ice water. For 3 days, he had watched his sons emerge from their shells, had seen glimpses of the children they used to be. The progress had felt miraculous, too good to be true, and now Samir's ominous tone suggested that perhaps it was exactly that, too good to be true. Omar dressed quickly and quietly, checking his phone for the usual morning alerts from the home security system. The cameras showed Aminata's room was empty. She was probably already in the kitchen preparing breakfast, as had become her routine. Zaid and Malik were still sleeping, curled in their beds like normal children instead of the restless, tormented souls they had been just days earlier. The drive to his office building felt longer than usual, every traffic light an opportunity for his mind to spiral through increasingly dark possibilities. What had Samir discovered? Was Aminata not who she claimed to be? Had he been so desperate for hope that he had ignored red flags that should have been obvious? Samir was waiting in Omar's office when he arrived, surrounded by printed documents and his laptop displaying what appeared to be news articles. Omar's brother looked like he hadn't slept. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loose, his expression grim with the weight of unwelcome knowledge. "Show me," Omar said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. Samir handed him a printed email. "This came from a contact I have in Dakar, someone who works in the refugee services sector. I asked him to look into Aminata Diallo's background after you told me you'd hired her." Omar scanned the email, written in French. His comprehension was good enough to understand the gist. Inquiries about a woman named Aminata Diallo, who had worked at a refugee center 3 years earlier, whose employment had ended under problematic circumstances. "What does problematic circumstances mean?" Omar asked. "Keep reading." The next document was a translated police report from Senegal, dated 2.5 years earlier. Omar's blood ran cold as he read the details. Aminata Diallo, age 29, had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of a 6-year-old girl from the refugee center where she worked. The child, identified as Fatou Kamara, had vanished during a night when Aminata was the only staff member on duty. "She was questioned but never charged," Omar said, looking up from the report. Read the rest. Additional documents painted a troubling picture. Witness statements from other refugee center staff described Aminata as overly attached to certain children, particularly those who had experienced trauma. One supervisor noted that she had been warned multiple times about inappropriate boundary crossing with the children in her care. The final document was the most damning. A psychological evaluation requested by the Refugee Center Administration, which described Aminata as exhibiting signs of unresolved grief related to personal loss, and recommended that she seek professional counseling before continuing work with vulnerable children. "Omar," Samir said gently, "the child who disappeared was never found. Aminata left Senegal less than 2 weeks later." Omar's hands trembled as he set the papers down. "This doesn't prove anything. She was never charged, never convicted. She was never cleared either. And look at this." Samir pulled up something on his laptop and turned the screen toward Omar. It was a social media profile, clearly belonging to Aminata, with photos dating back several years. In one image, she stood, holding hands with a young girl who bore a striking resemblance to her. The same warm eyes, the same gentle smile. "That's her daughter," Samir said quietly. "Adama Diallo. She died of malaria when she was 5 years old, just 6 months before Aminata started working at the refugee center. The pieces clicked together in Omar's mind with sickening clarity. A grieving mother, working with traumatized children, becoming overly attached to those who reminded her of her own lost child. The disappearance of 6-year-old Fatou, whose photo showed the same delicate features as Aminata's deceased daughter. "You think she took the girl," Omar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she's a woman destroyed by grief, who sees her dead daughter in other people's children. And I think Zaid and Malik, with their trauma and their need for maternal comfort, are exactly the kind of vulnerable targets that would appeal to someone with her psychological profile." Omar stood abruptly and walked to his office windows, staring out at the city below without seeing it. Everything Aminata had done suddenly took on a different cast. Her intuitive understanding of his son's needs, her seemingly magical ability to connect with them, her insistence on becoming part of their family. What if it wasn't wisdom and compassion, but obsession and delusion? "There's more," Samir said, reluctantly. "More what?" "I had someone check international travel records. Aminata didn't come to Qatar directly from Senegal. She spent 6 months in Morocco, working for a family there. They let her go after their 4-year-old son became what they described as unhealthily dependent on her. The child apparently had nightmares for weeks after she left. Omar's reflection in the window looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, desperate, aging in real time, as hope curdled into fear. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not earlier?" "Because I hoped I was wrong. Because I've seen how happy you've been these past few days, how much the boys seem to be improving. But Omar, what if that improvement is exactly what makes this situation dangerous? What if she's not healing them, but grooming them?" The word hit Omar like a physical blow. Grooming. The possibility that Aminata's patient, gentle approach wasn't therapeutic, but predatory, had never occurred to him. But now, viewed through the lens of Samir's research, every interaction took on a sinister quality. Her insistence on building trust slowly, her focus on making the boys dependent on her presence, her request that Omar not interfere with her methods, the way Zaid and Malik had begun calling her by increasingly affectionate names, the wooden bowl that encouraged them to share their deepest fears and feelings with her alone. "I have to go home," Omar said, reaching for his car keys. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Confront her, maybe, or just watch more carefully, see if there are signs I missed." "Omar, if I'm right about this, confronting her directly could be dangerous. Women like this, when they feel threatened, sometimes do desperate things." The drive home felt like traveling through a nightmare. Every memory of the past 3 days replayed in Omar's mind, but now the warm moments felt contaminated by suspicion. Had Aminata's patient sitting really been therapeutic, or had it been a calculated way to lower the boys' defenses? Were her gentle questions about their mother designed to help them heal, or to identify their vulnerabilities? By the time Omar reached his estate, he had worked himself into a state of controlled panic. He parked in his usual spot, but sat in the car for several minutes, trying to decide how to proceed. He could hear children's laughter coming from the garden, a sound that should have filled him with joy, but now made his skin crawl with anxiety. Through the garden gate, he could see Aminata sitting under the date palm with Zaid and Malik. They were engaged in what appeared to be a game involving the colorful fabric from yesterday, taking turns hiding small objects within its folds. The boys looked relaxed, happy even, but Omar now saw their trust as potential evidence of manipulation. Rather than healing, his phone buzzed with a text from Samir. "I'm sending you some articles about cases similar to this. Please read them before you make any decisions." Omar opened the attachments. News stories about caregivers who had become obsessed with their charges, about grieving parents who had kidnapped other people's children to fill the void left by their own losses. Each story followed a similar pattern, a period of seemingly miraculous improvement in the children's behavior, followed by increasing isolation from family members and eventually disappearance. "Papa," Zaid's voice called from the garden, "come play the treasure game with us." Omar's heart clenched. His son sounded genuinely happy, more animated than he had been in months. But what if that happiness was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation? What if Aminata was preparing to destroy his family just as thoroughly as the car accident had, but this time with calculated intention rather than random tragedy? He forced himself to smile and wave. "I'll be right there." But as he walked toward the garden, Omar's mind was already working on a different plan. The house's security system captured everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment when Aminata thought she was unobserved. If there was evidence of her true intentions, it would be there in the footage. Tonight, after everyone was asleep, he would review every hour of recorded material since Aminata's arrival. He would look for signs he had missed, patterns that revealed a real agenda, proof that would either confirm his worst fears or absolve him of the guilt that was already eating him alive. "Omar, you made it home early again," Aminata said as he approached, her smile warm and genuine. "The boys were just telling me about a treasure hunt you once took them on in the old souk." "Were they?" Omar managed, studying her face for signs. "Of deception and finding none. We're recreating it with the fabric," Malik explained, holding up a small toy car. "First, Papa hides something, then we follow the pattern to find it. Aminata says it's like the maze game, but backwards." "Backwards? How?" Omar asked, though part of him no longer wanted to hear her explanations, no longer trusted the wisdom that had seemed so natural just hours earlier. "Instead of following a path to find our way out of confusion, we create paths that lead others to discover hidden treasures," Aminata replied. "It teaches empathy, understanding how to guide someone else towards something wonderful." The explanation sounded innocent, even insightful, but in Omar's newly suspicious state of mind, it also sounded like a perfect metaphor for grooming, creating paths that led vulnerable children toward a predator's hidden agenda. "Papa, are you okay?" Zaid asked, studying his father's face with the perceptiveness that trauma had sharpened in both boys. "You look like when the doctors used to come to talk to you." Omar realized he was failing to hide his internal turmoil. From children who had become experts at reading adult emotional states for signs of impending abandonment or danger. "I'm fine," he lied, "just thinking about work." But as the afternoon wore on, Omar found himself watching Aminata with new eyes, cataloguing every gesture, every word, every moment of connection with his sons. Was her gentleness genuine or calculated? Were her insights the product of wisdom or study? Had she researched his family before arriving, learning about Yasmin's death and the boy's specific vulnerabilities in order to exploit them? By evening, Omar was exhausted from the mental effort of maintaining normalcy while internally dissecting every interaction for signs of manipulation. As he tucked Zaid and Malik into bed, a routine that had become peaceful again under Aminata's influence, he found himself memorizing his sons' faces, wondering if this might be one of the last normal evenings they would share. "Papa," Malik said sleepily, "Aminata says tomorrow we're going to plant something in the garden, something that will grow even when we're not watching it." "That sounds nice," Omar replied, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "She says, the best things grow slowly, and you have to trust them even when you can't see what's happening underground." As Omar turned off the lights and headed toward his study, Malik's innocent words echoed in his mind like a warning. What was growing slowly in his household? What was happening underground, in the spaces between his observation and understanding? Tonight, the cameras would tell him everything he needed to know. Tonight, he would finally see the truth about the woman he had invited into his children's lives, and pray that the truth wouldn't destroy what little remained of his family's chance at happiness. At 11:47 p.m., Omar sat alone in his private study, the glow of multiple monitors casting harsh shadows across his face. The house around him was silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the occasional settling sounds of marble and steel. Everyone was asleep, or so he assumed. What he was about to discover would shatter that assumption and everything else he thought he understood about the woman caring for his children. The security system's interface displayed a grid of camera feeds from throughout the mansion. Omar had spent the past 2 hours methodically reviewing footage from Aminata's first day, looking for signs he had missed, clues that might reveal her true intentions. What he found instead was a woman who seemed exactly as she had presented. Herself, patient, gentle, genuinely focused on his son's well-being. But now, as he advanced the timeline to more recent footage, something made him pause. A motion alert from the garden camera at 2:33 a.m. the previous night, a time when everyone should have been asleep. Omar's pulse quickened as he clicked on the timestamp. The infrared camera showed a figure moving across the garden with purposeful steps. Even in the grainy night vision, Omar could recognize Aminata's distinctive silhouette. She was fully dressed, carrying what appeared to be a small bag, and walking toward the far corner of the property, where an old gardening shed stood largely unused since Yasmin's death. Omar's hands trembled as he watched Aminata disappear into the shed for nearly 20 minutes before emerging empty-handed. She then walked to the fountain at the garden's center, where she knelt and appeared to be washing something. Her hands, perhaps, or an object too small to see clearly in the footage. "What the hell?" Omar whispered to the empty room. He fast-forwarded through the rest of the night, but Aminata didn't reappear on any cameras until 6 a.m., when she emerged from her room for her usual morning routine. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she had been awake in the middle of the night, engaged in mysterious activities while his children slept nearby. Omar's mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe she couldn't sleep and had gone for a walk. Maybe she had forgotten something in the shed earlier. Maybe the footage was misleading, showing shadows and shapes that his suspicious mind was interpreting as sinister when they were actually innocent. But as he continued reviewing the past 3 days of recordings, more anomalies emerged. Aminata speaking quietly to herself in what sounded like Arabic when she thought no one was listening, despite having claimed she only spoke French, English, and her native Wolof. Her careful examination of family photographs when the boys weren't around, studying images of Yasmin with an intensity that seemed to go beyond casual interest. Most disturbing was a moment from yesterday afternoon when Omar had seen Aminata apparently reading to the boys in the library. But the audio revealed she wasn't reading from the book in her hands at all. Instead, she was telling them stories about a magical land where children who had lost their mothers could find new families who would never, ever leave them. In this special place, her voice came through the speakers with hypnotic gentleness. Children don't have to be afraid anymore, because the mothers there know exactly how to love little boys who have been hurt. And the best part is, once you find your way to this place, you never have to go back to the sad world where people die in car accidents. Omar's blood turned to ice. On the surface, it seemed like a therapeutic fairy tale designed to comfort grieving children. But viewed through the lens of Samir's research, it sounded like something else entirely. A psychological preparation for kidnapping. Was Aminata planting the idea that leaving with her would be a rescue rather than an abduction? Was she convincing his sons that their current life was temporary, that their real happiness lay elsewhere? Omar advanced the footage to later that same evening, when he thought everyone had gone to bed. At 10:15 p.m., the hallway camera caught Aminata slipping quietly from her room and padding barefoot toward the boys' bedroom. Omar's heart hammered as he watched her pause outside their door, listening for several minutes before slowly turning the handle. The bedroom camera showed Aminata entering silently and approaching Malik's bed first. In the infrared glow, Omar could see his son sleeping peacefully, unaware of the figure standing beside him in the darkness. Aminata reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of fabric, perhaps, or a small object. She placed whatever it was under Malik's pillow, then moved to Zaid's bed and repeated the action. After standing motionless for nearly 5 minutes, just watching his sleeping children, she quietly left the room. Omar immediately called up the live camera feed from the boys' bedroom. Both children were sleeping soundly, but he could see the slight bulges under their pillows, where foreign objects had been hidden. His paternal instinct screamed at him to rush upstairs immediately to check what Aminata had planted near his vulnerable sons while they slept. But a more calculating part of his mind warned him to proceed carefully. If Aminata was indeed dangerous, confronting her directly might provoke exactly the kind of desperate behavior Samir had warned about. Instead, Omar decided to wait until morning to observe her interactions with the boys and look for signs that whatever she had hidden was part of a larger plan. The waiting was agony. Omar spent the remaining hours until dawn pacing his study, reviewing more footage and constructing increasingly dark scenarios about Aminata's intentions. By the time the sun began to rise over the Persian Gulf, he had convinced himself that he was harboring a dangerous predator who was systematically grooming his children for abduction. At 7 a.m., the live feed showed the boys waking naturally and beginning their morning routines. Omar watched with predatory intensity as Malik reached under his pillow and found whatever Aminata had placed there. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but Omar could see his son's face light up with delight as he examined the object. Zaid made a similar discovery, and both boys ran from their room with obvious excitement. Omar tracked their movement through the house cameras as they found Aminata in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Aminata! Aminata!" Zaid's voice carried clearly through the audio system. "The treasure fairies came again, did they?" Aminata replied with what sounded like genuine surprise. "What did they leave for you this time?" Omar's blood pressure spiked. Treasure fairies? Was this how she was framing her midnight visits, as magical occurrences rather than deliberate manipulation? "A tiny wooden bird," Malik exclaimed, holding up what Omar could now see was a small, intricately carved figure, "and it has my initial carved on the bottom." "Mine has a Z," Zaid added, displaying his own carved bird. "They must know our names. How wonderful!" Aminata said warmly. "The treasure fairies only visit children who are learning to trust in magic again. These birds are very special. They're protection birds. As long as you keep them close, you'll always be safe and loved." Omar's hands clenched into fists. Protection birds, safe and loved. The language was designed to make his sons feel that Aminata was their guardian, their protector against harm. But what if she was actually the source of the danger they needed protection from? Unable to watch any longer, Omar left his study and climbed the stairs toward the kitchen. He would confront this situation directly, demand explanations, and, if necessary, remove Aminata from his home immediately. His son's safety was more important than the progress they had made or the peace that had returned to their household. As he approached the kitchen, he could hear the boys chattering excitedly about their wooden birds, making plans to show them to their father when he woke up. The innocent joy in their voices made Omar's heart ache. How could he explain to them that their newfound happiness might be built on manipulation and lies? "Boys," Omar said as he entered the kitchen, his voice harsher than he intended. All three looked up, Zaid and Malik with bright smiles, Aminata with the calm attention he had grown accustomed to over the past few days. But now that calmness looked like calculation to Omar, as if she were constantly assessing and adapting her approach based on his reactions. "Papa!" Malik ran to him with his wooden bird clutched in his small fist. "Look what the treasure fairies brought. Aminata says they only come to children who are getting braver." Omar knelt to his son's eye level, taking the carved bird and examining it closely. The craftsmanship was exquisite, too exquisite to be a simple toy. This was the work of a skilled artisan, and the initial M carved into the base was done with professional precision. "Where do treasure fairies get wooden birds like this?" Omar asked, looking directly at Aminata. "I imagine they have many mysterious sources," she replied evenly. "Magic is difficult to explain with ordinary logic, is it?" Omar stood, still holding Malik's bird. "Because this looks like something that would be very expensive to commission from a woodcarver, not the kind of thing that appears by magic." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of coffee on the stove. Zaid and Malik looked between their father and Aminata with the kind of careful attention children develop when they sense adult tension but don't understand its source. "Papa," Zaid said quietly, "are you angry about the birds?" The innocent question hit Omar like a physical blow. His sons had experienced so little joy in the past 18 months, and now their father was questioning the first magical thing that had happened to them since their mother died. "I'm not angry about the birds," Omar said carefully. "I just want to understand where they came from." "Does it matter?" Aminata asked gently. "If something brings children happiness and comfort, does the source matter more than the result?" "It matters if the source has ulterior motives." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Aminata's expression didn't change, but Omar thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or disappointment that he would question her intentions so directly. "Papa," Malik said, his voice becoming smaller, "what are ulterior motives?" Omar realized he was on the verge of destroying something precious, not just his son's trust in Aminata, but their capacity to believe in goodness at all. If he was wrong about her, if his suspicions were the product of paranoia and his brother's research, rather than real evidence, he was about to traumatize his children all over again. "Ulterior motives," Omar said slowly, "are when people pretend to do nice things but really want something else." "What would Aminata want?" Zaid asked with genuine confusion. "She already has us. We already love her." The simple statement stopped Omar cold. "She already has us. We already love her." Was that the goal? Had Aminata succeeded in making his sons emotionally dependent on her as a prelude to something more sinister, or was a grieving father's paranoia destroying the first genuine healing his family had experienced since tragedy shattered their world? "I think," Aminata said quietly, "your papa is asking very important questions. It's good for fathers to protect their children by making sure the people who care for them are trustworthy." "Are you trustworthy?" Malik asked her directly with the kind of blunt honesty only children possess. Aminata knelt down to meet his eyes, her hands folded in front of her. "I try to be. But trustworthiness isn't something people can prove with words. It's something that shows itself through actions, over time." "How much time?" Zaid wanted to know. "However long it takes for your papa to feel sure that I'm here to help your family heal, not to hurt it." Omar found himself caught between admiration for her grace under pressure and suspicion that her perfect responses were evidence of careful manipulation. Was she a master manipulator, or simply a woman who understood that trust had to be earned rather than demanded? "I need to speak with Aminata privately," Omar announced. "Boys, please go play in the garden for a few minutes." "But we want to show you how the protection birds work," Zaid began. "Later," Omar said firmly. "Go play. Now." The boys reluctantly left the kitchen, clutching their wooden birds and casting worried glances over their shoulders. As soon as they were gone, Omar turned to face Aminata with the full weight of his suspicions and fears. "I know about Senegal," he said without preamble. "I know about the missing girl. I know about your daughter who died, and I know about the family in Morocco who let you go because their child became too attached to you." Aminata's composure finally cracked just slightly. Her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there moments before. "I wondered when you would find out," she said simply. "I hoped it wouldn't happen before your sons were strong enough to weather another abandonment." "Another abandonment?" Omar's voice rose. "You're talking as if I'm the one who's wrong here, as if asking questions about your background is some kind of betrayal, isn't it?" Aminata asked quietly. "Your sons have spent 4 days learning to trust again, learning to hope again, learning that not everyone who enters their world will leave them broken. And now their father is deciding whether to tear that trust away based on rumors and fears, rather than what he has seen with his own eyes." Omar stared at her, caught between rage and uncertainty. She was turning this around, making him the villain in a story where she might be the real threat to his family. The girl who disappeared in Senegal was found 3 days later in her uncle's village, where she had run after a nightmare convinced her that the men who killed her parents had come for her too. Aminata interrupted. "The police questioned everyone who worked at the center, including me. I left afterward because I couldn't bear to work with traumatized children while carrying the guilt of not preventing her fear-driven flight." "And the family in Morocco?" "Fired me because their son begged them not to send him to boarding school in France, and they blamed me for making him feel too safe at home to want to leave." Aminata's voice grew stronger, more defiant. "I have made mistakes, Mr. Rashid. I have loved children who weren't mine to love. I've given pieces of my heart to families who weren't ready to accept the full complexity of healing, but I have never, ever harmed a child." Omar wanted to believe her. The sincerity in her voice, the pain in her eyes, the simple logic of her explanations, it all argued for her innocence. But Samir's research had planted seeds of doubt that were proving difficult to uproot. "The wooden birds," he said. "You've been going to their room at night, placing things under their pillows. How is that not manipulation?" "Because," Aminata said simply, "sometimes children who have lost magic need adults to help them find it again. Your sons needed to believe that the world could still surprise them with kindness. If that's manipulation, then every parent who has ever put a tooth under a pillow or presents under a tree is guilty of the same crime." "But you're not their parent," Omar said harshly. "You're an employee, and employees who sneak into children's bedrooms at night cross boundaries that what?" Aminata's composure finally shattered completely. "That indicate what exactly? That I care too much, that I've watched your sons learn to smile again and wanted to protect that smile. That I know what it feels like to lose a child and would do anything to prevent other children from losing themselves to grief." Tears were flowing down her cheeks now, and Omar realized he was witnessing something raw and unguarded, either genuine anguish or masterful performance art. "Yes," she continued, her voice breaking, "I lost my daughter. Yes, I see pieces of her in every child I care for. Yes, I have loved other people's children with a fierceness that sometimes frightens even me. But love is not kidnapping, Mr. Rashid. Love is not manipulation. Love is getting up at 2 a.m. to carve wooden birds because 2 little boys need to believe in magic again." Omar stood silent, overwhelmed by the force of her emotion and the growing realization that he might have just destroyed something irreplaceable. Outside, he could hear Zaid and Malik playing in the garden. their laughter carrying through the morning air like a song of healing that he had just silenced forever. "Pack your things," he said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "I'll have the driver take you to the airport this afternoon." Aminata wiped her tears and nodded with dignity that made Omar feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. "I understand," she said. "But before I go, may I say goodbye to them? May I explain that this isn't their fault, that they haven't done anything wrong?" "No," Omar said, knowing he was being cruel but unable to stop himself. "Clean goodbyes are better. They'll understand eventually." "Will they?" Aminata asked, gathering her head wrap and preparing to leave the kitchen. "Or will they simply learn that love always ends in abandonment, that trust is always punished, that hope is always a lie adults tell children before they take it away?" She paused at the doorway, looking back at him with eyes that held no anger, only profound sadness. "I hope you're right about me, Mr. Rashid. I hope I really am the monster you think I am. Because if I'm not, you've just taught your sons the most devastating lesson of their young lives. That even when healing comes, even when love returns, even when magic feels real again, it can all disappear in an instant based on nothing more than fear." With that, she was gone, leaving Omar alone in a kitchen that suddenly felt as empty and cold as the rest of his mansion had before she arrived. Outside, his sons continued playing, unaware that their world was about to shatter once again, unaware that their father had just made a decision that would either save them from a predator or doom them to a darkness deeper than any they had known before. The silence that followed Aminata's departure was not the peaceful quiet that had graced the Rashid mansion during her stay, but something entirely different. A hollow, expectant hush that felt like the moment before a dam breaks. Omar stood in his kitchen, staring at the coffee that had grown cold during their confrontation, trying to summon the courage to walk outside and explain to his sons why the woman who had brought magic back into their lives was gone forever. Through the window, he could see Zaid and Malik still playing in the garden, completely absorbed in an elaborate game involving their wooden birds. They had arranged stones in a complex pattern and were guiding the carved figures through what appeared to be an obstacle course, complete with sound effects and animated commentary. "Careful, little bird," Zaid was saying to his carving. "The scary rocks can't hurt you if you remember you can fly." "My bird is teaching your bird the safe paths," Malik added, his voice carrying more confidence than Omar had heard since before Yasmin's death. "Birds who help each other never get lost. The innocence of their play, the joy in their voices, the creative cooperation that had emerged over the past 4 days, all of it was about to be destroyed because their father had chosen fear over faith, suspicion over trust." Omar's phone buzzed with a text from Samir. How did she take it? "Are the boys safe?" Safe. The word felt meaningless now. Physical safety, perhaps, but what about emotional safety? What about the safety that came from believing the world could be kind, that healing was possible, that love didn't always end in loss? Before Omar could formulate a response, he heard the front door open and close, Aminata leaving for the last time. He watched through the window as she walked past the garden without stopping, her small bag slung over her shoulder, her movements careful and controlled. The boys didn't see her go. They were too engrossed in their game to notice the woman who had rebuilt their capacity for joy, disappearing from their lives forever. At least, that's what Omar thought until Malik's head suddenly snapped up with the preternatural awareness children develop when their security is threatened. "Where's Aminata going?" Malik asked, abandoning his wooden bird and standing up. Zaid looked toward the front of the house, then back at his brother with growing alarm. "Why does she have her bag?" Omar realized with sickening clarity that he had no idea how to explain this to them. How do you tell 2 traumatized children that you've sent away the first person who had made them feel safe since their mother died? How do you justify destroying their trust based on suspicions that were beginning to feel less solid with each passing moment? "Papa!" Zaid called, having spotted Omar through the kitchen window. "Papa, come quick! Aminata is leaving!" Omar walked, outside on legs that felt like lead, his heart hammering against his ribs. His sons ran to him with expressions of mounting panic, the same look they had worn in the days immediately following Yasmin's funeral, when they couldn't understand why Mama wasn't coming home. "Where is Aminata going?" Malik demanded, his voice rising toward the pitch that usually preceded a complete emotional breakdown. "Is she coming back?" Zaid added, clutching his wooden bird so tightly that Omar worried it might break. "Boys," Omar began, then stopped. Every possible explanation felt like a betrayal, either of their trust or of his own judgment. How could he tell them that Aminata was dangerous when everything they had experienced suggested the opposite? How could he explain that sometimes adults had to make difficult decisions that children couldn't understand? "Papa," Malik said, his voice becoming smaller and more frightened with each word, "you have that look again, the look from when the doctors came, the look that means bad things are happening." Omar knelt down to meet his son's eyes, trying to find words that would cause the least damage to hearts that had already been broken too many times. "Aminata has to go away for a while," he said carefully. "Why?" Zaid's question was sharp, demanding. Because sometimes adults have disagreements about what's best for children." "But she was the best for us," Malik said, tears already starting to flow. "She made the scary dreams stop. She taught us about the treasure bowl and the quiet places, and the protection birds." "I know she did," Omar said, his own voice beginning to crack. "But is it because of the treasure fairies?" Zaid interrupted. "Because you were angry about the birds. We can give them back if you want. We can put them in the treasure bowl and say they're too sad to keep." The offer broke something fundamental in Omar's chest. His sons were willing to sacrifice their only sources of comfort to prevent another abandonment, and the fact that they thought their father's anger was directed at them rather than at Aminata revealed how little they understood about adult complexities, and how much they blamed themselves for everything that went wrong in their world. "It's not about the birds," Omar said desperately. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault." "Then why is she leaving?" Malik asked with the devastating logic of childhood. "If we didn't do anything wrong and you didn't do anything wrong, and she didn't do anything wrong, why can't she stay?" Omar had no answer that wouldn't either terrify them with stories of potential danger or force him to admit that he might have made a terrible mistake. So he chose the coward's path, the same one he had taken after Yasmin's death, when direct honesty felt too brutal for young hearts to bear. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make decisions that are hard to explain," he said weakly, but his sons had lived through too much loss to accept vague adult explanations. They had learned to read the spaces between words, to detect the tremor of uncertainty in voices that claimed authority, to sense when the people responsible for their safety were themselves lost and afraid. "You made her leave," Zaid said suddenly, his dark eyes blazing with an anger Omar had never seen directed at him before. "She didn't want to go. You made her." "Zaid, you did!" Malik joined his brother's accusation, his voice breaking completely. "Just like you made all the other ones leave. Just like you make everyone leave. That's not—" "It is." Zaid was crying now, angry tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than his 4-year-old understanding should have been able to reach. "You make everyone go away because you don't want us to love anyone except Mama, and Mama is dead." The words hit Omar like physical blows. His sons were not just mourning Aminata's departure. They were finally expressing the rage and abandonment they had been carrying since their mother's death. The fury at a father who had been physically present but emotionally absent, who had hired stranger after stranger to care for them while keeping himself safely distant from the possibility of additional loss. "You're scared," Malik said with devastating clarity, "and when you get scared, you send people away so you don't have to worry about them leaving by themselves." Omar stared at his 4-year-old son, realizing that Malik had articulated something about his own psychology that Omar hadn't even admitted to himself. Was that what this was really about? Not protecting his children from a potential predator, but protecting himself from the vulnerability of trusting someone new with the most precious parts of his life. "But Aminata wasn't going to leave," Zaid continued, his voice raw with grief and anger. "She told us that some people stay even when things get hard. She said we could trust her to be different from all the others. And now she's gone just like all the rest," Malik whispered, "and it's all your fault." The accusation hung in the air between them, true and terrible and impossible to refute. Omar had indeed sent Aminata away, had chosen suspicion over hope, had decided that the risk of being wrong about her was greater than the certainty of traumatizing his sons by taking her away. "I was trying to protect you," Omar said weakly. "From what?" Zaid demanded. "From being happy, from feeling safe, from having someone who understood our quiet games and our sad stories and our protection birds?" Omar couldn't answer because he was beginning to realize that he didn't know anymore. Was he protecting them from Aminata, or from the possibility that healing might require him to trust someone besides himself with his children's well-being? The sound of a car engine starting in the driveway sent both boys running toward the front of the house. Omar followed, his heart sinking as he watched them press their faces against the iron gates, watching Aminata's taxi disappear down the palm-lined street. "Aminata!" Malik called desperately, as if his voice could somehow reach her across the growing distance. "Come back! We're sorry! We'll be better! We promise," Zaid added, his small hands gripping the gate's bars. "We won't ask for treasure, fairies anymore. We won't need magic stories." The sight of his sons begging the empty street for forgiveness they didn't need to ask for shattered the last of Omar's certainty about his decision. These children weren't celebrating their rescue from a predator. They were mourning the loss of someone who had become essential to their healing, someone who had taught them that the world could be gentle again. Over the next few hours, Omar watched his sons retreat into behaviors he hadn't seen since Aminata's arrival. Zaid returned to his mechanical destruction, systematically tearing apart the fabric maze they had created together, his movements sharp and angry. Malik wedged himself back into the corner of the playroom, rocking and humming to himself, but now the humming sounded less like self-soothing and more like keening. By evening, neither boy would eat dinner. They refused to take baths, refused to engage with any of the house staff, refused to respond when Omar tried to comfort them. They had built walls around themselves again, but this time the walls felt different, not just protective, but accusatory, as if they were shutting out a father who had proven himself untrustworthy. That night, Omar found himself standing outside their bedroom door, listening to the sound of quiet crying from within. When he tried to enter, Zaid's voice stopped him cold. "Go away, Papa. We don't want you here." "Boys, I know you're upset, but you don't know anything," Malik's voice added, thick with tears. "You don't know how to keep people safe. You only know how to send them away." Omar pressed his forehead against the door, feeling more helpless than he had at any point since Yasmin's death. His sons were right to reject him. He had failed them in the most fundamental way possible, not by failing to protect them from harm, but by failing to recognize healing when it appeared and destroying it with his own fear. It was nearly midnight when Omar made the decision that would change everything. He couldn't undo what he had done, couldn't take back the words that had sent Aminata away, couldn't repair the trust he had shattered with his sons. But he could admit that he had been wrong. He could call her, he could apologize. He could beg her to come back and hope that the damage wasn't irreparable. But when Omar tried to reach Aminata's phone, he discovered that the number had been disconnected. The hotel where he thought she might be staying had no record of her reservation. It was as if she had vanished from Qatar entirely, leaving no trace except the wounded hearts of two little boys who had learned once again that love was temporary and trust was dangerous. "She's gone," Omar whispered to his empty study, surrounded by security monitors that showed a house full of broken people learning to live with another layer of loss. But as he sat in the darkness, reviewing footage of better days, when laughter had filled these rooms, Omar began to notice things he had missed before. The careful way Aminata had documented their progress with small videos on her phone. Videos she had never shared with him, but had clearly been creating as a record of his son's healing journey. The meticulous notes she had been keeping in a small journal, tracking every breakthrough, every setback, every moment of growth. Most telling of all was a conversation he found from 2 days earlier, captured by the garden camera when she thought she was alone. Aminata had been sitting by the fountain, speaking quietly into her phone in what Omar now realized was Arabic. "No, I cannot leave yet," she was saying to someone. "These children still need time. Their father is frightened. He has been hurt. Too much to trust easily. But the boys are healing, and healing cannot be rushed. Yes, I know the visa will expire soon, but surely a few more weeks. I understand. I will make arrangements." Omar replayed the conversation multiple times, his understanding shifting with each listen. Aminata hadn't been planning to stay indefinitely or to take his children away. She had been trying to extend her time with them because she believed they needed more healing than could be accomplished in a few days. She had been fighting to stay, not planning to leave, and Omar had sent her away based on suspicions that now seemed less like protective instincts and more like the paranoid fantasies of a man too damaged by loss to recognize love when it appeared. As dawn broke over the Persian Gulf, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of Yasmin's favorite scarves, Omar came to a devastating realization. He had become the very thing he was trying to protect his sons from. He had become the person who abandoned them when they needed him most, who chose fear over faith, who broke trust instead of building it. The only question now was whether it was too late to undo the damage, too late to find Aminata and bring her back, too late to teach his sons that sometimes adults could admit they were wrong and fight to make things right. Outside, he could hear Zaid and Malik beginning to stir in their beds, waking to another day in a world that had proven, once again, that hope was a luxury children couldn't afford to indulge. But as Omar watched the sunrise paint his mansion in shades of gold and possibility, he made a promise to himself and to his sons. He would find her. He would bring her back. And if it wasn't too late, he would prove that love could triumph over fear, that trust could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that led back home. The search for Aminata consumed Omar for the next 72 hours, during which he discovered resources and connections he never knew he possessed. What began as desperate phone calls to hotels and airlines evolved into a comprehensive investigation involving private security firms, diplomatic contacts, and even social media specialists who could track digital footprints across international borders. His sons, meanwhile, had retreated so completely into their protective shells that the house staff began expressing concerns about their refusal to eat or engage with anyone. Layla found Malik one morning, sleeping curled up in the garden shed where Aminata had gone that mysterious night, clutching his wooden bird and whispering to it as if it were the only friend he had left in the world. "Mr. Omar," Layla said during one of Omar's brief returns home between search efforts, "the boys are asking questions I don't know how to answer." "What kind of questions?" "Malik wants to know if people who leave Qatar can ever come back. Zaid keeps asking if we have Aminata's phone number in heaven like we have Mama's." Layla's expression was grave. "They think she's dead, sir. They think... That's why she left without saying goodbye." The realization hit Omar like cold water. His sons weren't just mourning Aminata's departure, they were reliving their mother's sudden absence, processing this new abandonment through the lens of their deepest trauma. In their 4-year-old understanding, people didn't just leave. They died, disappeared forever, became unreachable except through prayers and memories. "I have to find her," Omar told Layla, though he was beginning to fear that Aminata had disappeared. As completely as if she had indeed died, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Zamir, who had been quietly supporting the search efforts despite his initial warnings about Aminata, called with information from his contact at the Senegalese embassy. "Omar, she's in Morocco," Samir said without preamble. "She never left on a plane. She took a bus to Kuwait, then flew from there to Casablanca. My contact says she's working at a children's hospital in Rabat in their trauma unit." "Why Morocco?" Omar asked, though he was already mentally calculating flight times and making arrangements. "According to my source, it's where she always goes when she needs to remember why she does this work. The hospital there doesn't ask questions about papers or backgrounds, they just put her to work with children who need help." 2 hours later, Omar was on his private jet to Morocco, carrying with him a folder of printed photographs showing his son's progress during Aminata's brief stay. If words couldn't convince her to return, perhaps images of Zaid and Malik laughing, playing, healing, could speak the truth about what she had accomplished and what her departure had destroyed. The hospital in Rabat was nothing like the gleaming medical facilities Omar was accustomed to in Qatar. Built of weathered stone and surrounded by olive trees, it felt more like a sanctuary than a clinical institution. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and the sound of laughter mixed with the usual hospital rhythms of beeping machines and hurried footsteps. Omar found Aminata in the pediatric garden, sitting cross-legged on a blanket while a group of young patients arranged colored stones in patterns around her. She wore the same simple clothes she had favored in Qatar, but something about her posture suggested a weariness that hadn't been there before. When she looked up and saw him standing at the garden's entrance, her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling on careful neutrality. "Mr. Rashid," she said quietly, not rising from her position on the blanket. "I didn't expect to see you in Morocco." "I came to apologize," Omar said, approaching slowly as if she were a wounded animal that might flee if startled, "and to ask you to come back." "Apologize for what?" Aminata asked, though her tone suggested she knew the answer. "For not trusting you, for believing suspicions over evidence, for destroying something beautiful because I was too afraid to believe it could last." The children around Aminata watched this exchange with the intense curiosity of young people who sensed adult drama unfolding. She spoke to them softly in Arabic, asking them to continue their stone patterns while she spoke with her visitor. "How are Zaid and Malik?" she asked once the children had resumed their play. Omar's throat tightened. "Broken. They think you're dead because you left without saying goodbye. They've stopped eating, stopped talking to anyone, stopped believing that good things can happen to them." Aminata's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I wanted to say goodbye, but you said—" "I was wrong," Omar interrupted. "About everything. I found the footage of your phone call about the visa extension. I found your notes documenting their progress. I found evidence of everything you were really doing, and none of it was what I feared." "What did you fear?" Aminata asked, though again her tone suggested she already knew. "That you were going to take them from me, that your love for them was dangerous rather than healing, that I was going to lose them the way I lost Yasmin." Omar knelt on the edge of the blanket, making himself physically smaller, less imposing. "But I was wrong about the real danger. which was me. I was the danger. I was the one who was going to destroy their chance at happiness because I was too scared to trust anyone else with their hearts. Aminata studied his face for a long moment, and Omar could see her weighing his words against her own pain, measuring his sincerity against the hurt of being rejected and accused. "You hurt me," she said finally. "Not just by sending me away, but by making me doubt myself. For the first time in years, I was beginning to heal too, watching your sons remember how to trust. When you accused me of having ulterior motives, it made me question whether my love for traumatized children really was healthy, or if I was just using them to fill the void left by my daughter's death." "I'm sorry," Omar said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry for hurting you, for doubting you, for projecting my fears onto your love. You were healing my sons, and you were healing me too, even though I was too blind to see it. Healing you how? By showing me what it looked like to love without controlling, to help without hovering, to trust the process of recovery instead of trying to manage every outcome." Omar reached into his jacket and pulled out the folder of photographs. "By giving me back my sons." Aminata accepted the photos with trembling hands, and Omar watched her face transform as she saw image after image of Zaid and Malik during their brief golden period, building stone patterns, tracing fabric mazes, making cookies, laughing on the terrace at sunset. "They were so happy," she whispered, touching one photo that showed both boys with flour-covered hands raised in victory after successfully making their mother's cookies. "They were," Omar agreed, "and they could be again if you're willing to. Give us another chance. Us? All of us. The boys need you, obviously, but I need you too. I need someone who can teach me how to be the father they deserve instead of the father I've been, one who's so afraid of losing them that he pushes away. Anyone who might help them thrive." Aminata set the photos down carefully and looked directly into Omar's eyes. "What's different now? What's changed that makes you think you won't panic again the first time someone questions my methods or my background?" It was a fair question, and Omar had prepared for it during the long flight to Morocco. "What's changed is that I've seen what happens when I choose fear over faith. I've watched my sons retreat back into trauma because their father was too damaged to recognize healing when it appeared. I've realized that the biggest risk to my family isn't trusting the wrong person. It's failing to trust the right one. And if your brother finds more concerning information about my past, if other family members or friends plant new seeds of doubt, then I'll remember this conversation. I'll remember the photos you just looked at. I'll remember that my sons have never been happier than they were during the 4 days you cared for them." Omar paused, choosing his next words carefully. "And I'll remember that love always requires risk, but the alternative to loving is a kind of death." Aminata was quiet for a long time, watching the children around them create increasingly elaborate patterns with their stones. Finally, she spoke. "I can't go back to being just a nanny, Mr. Rashid. If I return, it has to be as family, not an employee who can be dismissed when fear overtakes trust, but someone with a permanent place in your sons' lives." Omar felt a flutter of the old anxiety, the desire to maintain control, to keep escape routes available, to avoid the vulnerability that came with irreversible commitments. But then he thought of Zaid and Malik sleeping in the garden shed, whispering to wooden birds about their lost friend, and the fear transformed into something else. Determination. "What would that look like?" he asked. "Legal guardianship papers. Not adoption. I would never try to replace their mother, but formal recognition that I have rights and responsibilities regarding their welfare that can't be revoked by a moment of panic or suspicion." The request was enormous, legally complex, and exactly what Omar's rational mind warned against. It meant sharing parental authority with someone he had known for less than a week, trusting a virtual stranger with decisions that could affect his children's entire futures. It was also exactly what his sons needed. Proof that the adults in their world could make commitments that transcended fear, evidence that love could be permanent rather than conditional, demonstration that healing was worth protecting with legal safeguards. "Yes," Omar said without hesitation. "Whatever paperwork needs to be filed, whatever legal processes need to be followed, yes." Aminata's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified," Omar admitted, "but I'm sure." The flight back to Qatar felt different from any journey Omar had ever taken. For the first time in 18 months, he was returning home with hope instead of dread, bringing healing instead of loss, carrying the promise of restoration rather than the weight of failure. But the real test came when they walked through the front door of the Rashid mansion and found Zaid and Malik sitting on the marble staircase, still clutching their wooden birds, their faces bearing the hollow expression of children who had given up expecting good things to happen. "Boys," Omar said gently, "someone wants to see you." Aminata stepped into view, and for a moment that felt eternal, nobody moved. The twins stared at her as if she were a mirage that might disappear if they acknowledged her presence too enthusiastically. Then Malik whispered, "Aminata, are you real?" "I'm real," she replied, kneeling down and opening her arms. "And I'm home." The boys launched themselves at her with the force of 18 months' worth of suppressed hope, and as Omar watched his sons sob with relief in the arms of the woman who had taught them to trust again, he realized that this was what victory looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of love strong enough to overcome it. That evening, as the four of them sat on the terrace sharing imperfect cookies and watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors, Zaid looked up at his father with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. "Papa," he said seriously, "are you going to learn how to keep people safe by letting them stay instead of making them go away?" "I'm going to try," Omar replied honestly. "Will you help me learn?" "We'll all help each other," Malik added, leaning against Aminata with the confidence of a child who knew he was genuinely safe. That's what families do. And as the stars began to appear over the Persian Gulf, Omar understood that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that required courage, trust, and the willingness to believe that love could triumph over fear, that hope could survive loss, and that sometimes the most important thing a father could do was admit he was wrong and fight to make it right. The wooden birds sat on the table between them, no longer symbols of mysterious magic, but tangible reminders that the most powerful miracles were often the ones that happened quietly, in the spaces between fear and faith, in the moment when broken hearts decided to trust again. 6 months later, Omar would frame the legal guardianship papers that made Aminata officially part of their family. 1 year later, he would watch Zaid and Malik perform a song about treasure fairies at their school's cultural celebration, with Aminata proudly recording every note. 2 years later, he would walk into their playroom and find all three of them working together on a photo album titled Our Healing Story, documenting the journey from brokenness to wholeness that had begun with a desperate father's decision to trust a gentle stranger with his children's wounded hearts. But on this evening, as the first stars appeared over their restored home, Omar simply held his sons close and marveled at the simple miracle of a family learning to love without fear, to trust without reservation, and to believe that sometimes the most important magic was the decision to choose hope over despair, faith over suspicion, and healing over the safety of remaining broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.